I saw my first UFC in high school and fell in love with the sport instantly. I've been a Taekwondo student since I was 10 and loved anything martial arts anyway. MMA was just the next logical step in my mind. I told my parents, and they searched until they found a dojo in our area that offered jiu-jitsu and kickboxing classes. I was 14 when I joined that gym. Around 16, I dropped Taekwondo altogether to focus on my grappling and boxing. I worked out religiously and waited until I was good enough to go pro. And my first ever pro fight occurred just 4 days after my 18th birthday. I actually won by KO in less than 45 seconds, and there was no looking back after that. My future was in the UFC, and I was willing to do all I could to get there. My parents were always supportive, even allowing me to live at home rent-free. Their only rule was that I had to have a job just in case fighting didn't work out. I didn't mind it. Training and equipment didn't pay for itself after all. During the time my story takes place, I was a bouncer at a small music venue downtown. The club hosted mostly hip-hop and rap artists. The night the following happened, there had been a gang shooting the week before, and tensions in the community were high, and we had explicit orders to make sure things stayed safe. The guys working the door were always good about keeping weapons from getting through. As long as a guy was unarmed, I stood a 99% chance of winning a fight if it came down to it. But we tried our hardest to prevent things from getting that far. It was supposed to be a slow night, but a number of unforeseen things would turn it into a nightmare. The DJ we booked turned out to be more popular than we thought, and the club was packed early. To add to the problems, the owner had decided to sell $2 beers to make up for the low attendance. This led to a bunch of drunk kids. A few technical troubles on the DJ's end caused a late start, and this almost caused a riot. Thankfully, the problems were quickly worked out and the annoyed crowd appeared to be calming down. The mood was fairly chill for about an hour until the DJ took a short break. I was speaking to one of the guys at the door when a loud ruckus erupted from near the bar. I could see two guys swinging on each other. The bigger of the pair was losing until a few of his friends jumped in to help. The smaller guy was already down before I could reach them. He'd been kicked several times and was unconscious. I grabbed the first guy I saw and pulled him away. Another bouncer had joined me and he was dealing with the second guy. A friend of the guy I was holding hit me from behind on the head with a bottle. Now I was rocked and couldn't focus on what was going on. I let go of the guy and he took the opportunity to start wailing on me. My training kicked in then. I was holding my own until he hit me with one firm jab. I stumbled back into the bar and blacked out. I came to in the office with a miserable headache and very confused. The paramedics arrived soon after. I tried to convince them I was okay, but they could tell that I wasn't. I was taken to the hospital where they found a small bleed in my brain. Surgery was done to relieve the pressure on my brain, and after some time I was able to recover. The authorities did manage to find and convict the guy who knocked me out. He ended up with 16 months, all of which he'd served while waiting for trial. So in a sense, he kinda got off scot-free. I never believed the kid could have put me down without the bottle breaking over my head first. I've been hit harder by little girls. And speaking of the bottle, the cops were never able to decide who actually did it. For the most part, I had never received any real justice, I felt. I spoke to attorneys about civil suits, but neither myself nor my parents had the kind of money that it would take. Not to mention, the chances of ever getting paid were insanely low. The injury has left a few long-term impacts on my life. Probably the worst was the end of my fighting career. Every doctor I've spoken to has made it clear that I would be putting my life on the line by stepping into a cage again. Even if I didn't die, I could end up a vegetable. That's no way to live, I thought. I'd rather be dead in that case. Finding a doctor that would be willing to release me to fight would be difficult too. As a whole, I'd rate the whole experience a strong thumbs down. And nonetheless, I'm proud to say that I retired at 9-0, all of those being KOs. But after the attack, I was in no hurry to return to work. I figured the job was only going to get more dangerous. In fact, not even a year later, a guy working the door got killed during a drive-by shooting. He wasn't even the target. He just happened to catch a stray bullet. With no other options, I decided to join the exciting world of auto repossessions. In truth, this work is relatively safe in my area. Most people don't really care if you take the car, and fewer would be willing to kill you for it. My son has taken up the gloves now and shows a lot of natural talent, and more than I did at that age, I suppose. Maybe he'll decide to go pro and succeed where his old man didn't, but that's his choice. As long as he stays away from clubs and bars, I think he'll be okay. When I met Wyatt, I was a shy 22-year-old bookworm. He was an outgoing, handsome, and fit jock that hopped from girl to girl. And why he was attracted to a bookish nerd like me, I'll never know. I was nearing the end of my time at the university and needed a large injection of cash. I've had jobs prior to bartending, but they'd never been so fast-paced and stressful. I wasn't sure if I was up to it, but my friend put in a good word for me with her boss. And this gave me that extra little bit of motivation I needed, since I hated letting down anyone who put their neck out for me. Wyatt could tell how nervous I was and used his charming wit and looks to put me at ease. Maybe he just wanted to get me in bed, I don't know. It made no difference. I took the job easier than I suspected, and I had him to thank for it. When he asked me out, I agreed without a second thought. Our time together may have been short, but I loved every second of it. I tell you all this personal stuff not to brag, but to give you some sense of how serious his death was to me when it came. If he remains the love of my life 22 years later, he had to have been the one. On the night I lost him, I'd been called in to cover for another girl who never showed. Wyatt was working the door. A line was already curving around the block when I arrived. The club was popular with locals and tourists alike. I can't remember a shift where the place wasn't packed to the rafters. He was doing his job as usual, checking IDs as patrons entered, when he heard an argument going on down the block. Another guy took his place while he went to check it out. About halfway through the line, he caught sight of a couple. The male was yelling at the female, accusing her of flirting. The girl yelled back and the man slapped her. This had to have pissed off Wyatt. Despite being a big and imposing football player, he'd been raised in a family with 3 sisters who he was very protective of. He hated men who mistreated women and wouldn't hesitate to step in whenever he witnessed it. It's selfish to say, but I wish he wouldn't have in this case. Witnesses said that after the man hit his girlfriend, Wyatt charged the guy and yanked him back so hard that he fell backwards onto the sidewalk. This is where Wyatt made his biggest mistake. He turned to the girl and asked her if she was okay. He also suggested that they call the police. During this discussion, his back was turned to the man. Said man got up from the sidewalk and drew a knife from his pocket. Several of those in line tried to warn Wyatt, but he reacted too late and was already stabbed twice before he had turned completely around. He managed to fight the man off, but he'd sustained an additional 2 wounds in the process. He ran for the door to get help. Bystanders said that he was already bleeding heavily when he reached the door. One employee tried to put pressure on the wounds while another called 911. While this was all happening, the assailant grabbed his girlfriend and dragged her off to their car where he made his getaway. Fortunately, some clubgoers got the plate number before the man drove off. I was so busy I didn't notice the panic going on at the door. When another employee came up to me and started yelling in my ear, I thought he was crazy. A short gap in the music gave me the chance to hear what he was saying. I dropped everything and ran for the door. We'd always kept our relationship quiet during work hours to prevent any complaints from the boss, but in this moment, none of that mattered. He was already beginning to fade in and out when the ambulance arrived. I wanted to go with them, but there'd be no one left to tend the bar, so I stayed. Had I known that would be the last time I'd see him alive, I would have gone. Damn the consequences. I cleaned up the best I could and went back to work, but in truth, I was only there in body. I couldn't think of anything but Wyatt. The strange thing is, I hadn't once considered the possibility he could die. The paramedics had been so calm, and I didn't think something like a little pocket knife could kill someone, especially someone as big and strong as Wyatt. The call came through around closing. I was cleaning up as fast as possible so I could get to the hospital. The look on the waitress's face was chilling. Her reluctance to tell me made me furious, and I began to panic, and this made her even more sheepish. I had to scream at her to get the truth. They said he didn't make it out of surgery. I'm so sorry. Her words just hung in the air. I wanted to slap her. It was as if she'd defamed my mother. I didn't want to believe it. I stormed out and raced to the hospital, and no matter who I asked, no one could tell me anything. Then I ran into Nick, the club's owner. His face said everything, and I collapsed to the floor and cried until I had no tears left to shed. Rather than mourn as I should have, I focused all my energy into making sure the garbage that killed him was convicted. Thanks to those patrons, he was arrested quickly. The wait for the trial seemed to be an eternity. In that time, I'd graduated and moved to Denver for work. I returned for the trial and sat through each and every day of it. We figured since the guy had a lot of prior convictions, life was a certainty. The guy's lawyer claimed self-defense, saying he was scared for his life because Wyatt was so much bigger than him. This didn't get him off, but the judge allowed it to be a consideration by the jury toward the verdict. The short of it was that the loser got 25 years instead of the hoped-for life. I was livid, but there was nothing I could do. This was the point at which Wyatt's death hit me head-on. I'll just say the road was long and painful. It's not something I'd like to relive. Once I was finally able to get my act straight, I focused on my future. Everything after that has led me here. It's the anniversary of Wyatt's death tomorrow, so I thought that I'd mark it by sharing the story with everyone. Perhaps it will serve as a wake-up call. I hope if you have someone special, you are allowed a long and happy time together. Life is shorter than we realize. A surplus of time is a luxury none of us have. Don't waste the little you've been given by not sharing your love with others. Back before I got on with TI, I used to work security at a music venue. I'd been there about 3 months when the owner hired his nephew to work with me. The guy seemed cool, and we turned out to have a lot of the same interests and hobbies. The dude was built like a concrete bunker and covered in tattoos. When I discovered he was an army vet, I invited him to go shoot with me at a nearby outdoor range. This was the first time I began to question his mental stability. Everything was normal at first, but soon he started mumbling to himself after shooting. I thought maybe I was going deaf and asked him to repeat what he said. He just stared at me for a few seconds and went back to shooting. I ignored it and returned to shooting myself. The session ended and we went our separate ways. I decided not to go to the range with him after that. It was a minor quirk, but being around him while he was armed didn't feel right. That was the only time he and I would see each other outside of work. I remained friendly with him and we continued to get along well, and as the weeks went by, more little incidents occurred and I began to believe that he was high on the clock. I'd seen it before, the constant trips to the bathroom and short temper with patrons. These incidents made me all but certain. For the time being, it wasn't affecting his work, so I kept it to myself. When the time came to say something, I approached him, but he denied it. It had gotten so bad he reeked like alcohol every shift. I contacted his uncle and got the mind your own business and you're no angel yourself excuses. It was true. I had my share of vices, but I kept them off the clock and far away from my family. It sucked, but I'd done my part. If the guy killed someone, it wasn't my responsibility. His drug and alcohol use just got worse, though. His uncle must have said something to him. Anytime I tried to strike up a conversation, he ignored me. There was a brief ray of hope when he began seeing this girl. His use appeared to be stopping, but within a couple of months, he was back to his old ways. And here's where the crazy stuff happens. He was working the door one rainy night, and I was helping out behind the bar on something. I heard something crazy going down at the door and started that way. I came around the corner and saw a dude fighting these two cops. One had him in a chokehold, trying to cuff him, and the other was trying to help. I had no desire to assist either party, especially the pigs. I just stood by and watched the guy get free and beat the crap out of both cops. He ran out of the club after that and disappeared. I knew he'd do something crazy eventually, but I had to wait until he was arrested to hear the facts. He was picked up at his parents' house a few days later. This time there was no fighting back. Like everybody else at work, I was curious as to his supposed crime, but hadn't been actively searching for the answer. The day after he was caught, the sound guy showed me a short news article on his phone. According to the paper, he had gotten into an argument with his girlfriend and began beating her. When she fought back, he handcuffed her to a radiator and continued beating her. The victim claimed that he was arguing with invisible people and constantly under the influence of alcohol and cocaine. The craziest part was that he continued going to work each evening while leaving her cuffed to that radiator. That last night, she managed to get free and notify the cops. They went straight to the club and attempted to arrest him, and not very well, I may add. This was in late 2018, and I'm not sure how long he was given in prison, but one person said it was something like 7 years, which means he's probably out by now. I hope he got some help while he was locked up. It was clear most of his trouble was related to PTSD and the like. The drugs were probably a way to deal with it, but they just made his problems worse. Like I said, most of the time he was a cool dude. I'm sure he would have made out well had he not been subjected to all that terrible stuff. Don't misconstrue my meaning here either. I greatly respect veterans and their willingness to sacrifice their minds and bodies to do what they believe to be right. I wish we continued to invest in them after their service is over. We owe it to them. I'll stop the rant there and wrap things up. Despite the terrible thing he did, I hope the guy's been able to get clean and put his life back together. The same goes for his victim. There's no way she deserved what she got, and that's it for me. If I happen to hear anything new or interesting, I'll post an update. And I hope all of you are doing well and everyone's families have been reunited. Good luck out there, and stay safe. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Today, at 34, I'd wager if you asked anyone who knows me, they describe me as a responsible and hard-working family man. These days, they would be right, but they didn't know me before. Back in Chicago where I grew up, I was a very different person. Between the ages of 16 and 27, I lived life at full speed. Childhood was a nightmare. I ran away multiple times until at 16, my mom stopped looking for me. From then on, I was on my own, hopping from squat to squat and shelter to shelter. Danger lurked around every corner and you couldn't trust anyone. I stayed high most of the time. You had to, just to deal with things from your past and things you'd just done to survive. It's not a life I'd wish on anyone. At 18, I began renting this dumpy apartment with 5 other kids. It was a little more than a squat, but the price was right. Making money was always a concern, and most straight people wouldn't hire folks like us. A lot of the girls ended up stripping. It was safer than hooking, at least. The quick money and attention could be addictive for a lot of them. Yet no matter how much money they made, the ghosts of their past couldn't be avoided. With money and emotional problems, almost always comes drugs. I learned this at a young age. Nearly every girl I hooked up with stripped. Most would also escort off the clock. I didn't get jealous like some of the guys. I was just with them for the money to begin with. Love was something I thought had been beaten out of me forever. And thankfully, I turned out to be wrong on that count. After nearly 10 years of dealing with crazy, drug-addled chicks with serious daddy issues, I finally learned my lesson. I had been seeing this dancer on and off again for around 6 months. Both of us had major drug problems and fought constantly. I'd had enough and broke it off the week before. She had a key to my apartment, and I wanted it back. The only place I knew where to find her was at work. She was on the main stage when I arrived. I sat at the bar and had a drink while I waited. A couple of the bouncers gave me dirty looks. Although weird, I ignored it. She came over to me when she'd finished and asked to talk in private. I figured that she was going to try and talk her way back into my life, but I agreed. We went off around the side of the stage where the girls did lap dances and sat down. She started coming on to me, but I pushed her away. I wasn't rough or anything close. When she realized her plan wasn't working, she began throwing a fit. I mean, she was so loud it drowned out the music. At one point, she slapped herself and left a big handprint on her face. I wish I could say I was surprised, but I was used to crazy by now. I leaned back in my chair and watched until two bouncers from earlier ran around the corner and snatched me up to my feet. She pointed at the mark on her face and said, "See? I told you he hits me." I burst out laughing. I'd never struck a woman except for once when a meth head attacked me with a knife, and certainly never hit any of my girlfriends. I guess the bouncers didn't get the joke. She had obviously filled their heads with a load of BS about me beating her, and the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. I was going to pay. And for about 15 minutes, I did. Even when compared with the beatings I got from my mom's boyfriends when I was younger, I've never been pummeled that bad. I was thrown out the back door when they'd finished, and I can still remember the stink of the dumpster and how bad it hurt to breathe. And it's a miracle I made it home. I laid curled up in a ball in bed for over a week, only occasionally getting up to go to the can or answer the door for my dealer. I'd already decided that I was going to clean up and start off new somewhere else. I only stayed on the pills because of the pain, but once I'd healed up enough, I even quit with those. I'd initially tried to go cold turkey, but that wasn't happening. I had the number of a friend who worked at an inpatient treatment facility and he got me in. 30 days later, I walked out a new man. It was the first day I'd seen the streets as a sober man since I was 13. My options were endless now. I could go anywhere and do anything, and it was up to me to make the best of this second chance. Truth is, I was 27 and hadn't worked a legit job for more than a month at a time. Chicago was full of all the wrong people and too many bad memories. I hopped on a bus to Florida and never looked back. When I arrived in Miami, I walked from construction site to construction site. I begged for any job, no matter how small. I did eventually find someone who gave me a chance. For almost 9 months, I'd show up and clean and do anything I was asked to do. My hard work paid off, and I was hired on full-time in the office. The boss must have seen something in me that I'd never seen in myself. My boss, Sam, turned out to have a daughter. She'd come up to the site on occasion to see her dad, and I'd never seen a more beautiful girl in my life, but the chance of her and I ever being anything was unfathomable. There was no way I was going to risk the position I'd carved out for myself, regardless of how insignificant it may have been. I kept my head down and did my job. It turned out, she and her dad had a different plan. Sam began dropping hints that Linda, not her real name, was divorced. She started coming up to the office a lot more and even introduced me to her son. I wanted this all to be real, but I was terrified. I guess she got tired of waiting and asked me over for dinner. After a year in living in what amounted to be a closet alone, I accepted. That night was an entirely new experience. I was amazed at her and her son's relationship. I'm ashamed to admit this, but I cried when I got back to my place. Seeing what I missed as a child was heartbreaking. Things took a nice gradual course after that first date. I assumed Linda would bail as soon as she had heard about my past, but she stuck beside me. We dated a further year before getting married, and naturally, Sam was my best man. We've since had a daughter and hope to have one more child. It's been a steep learning curve when it comes to family, but like most other things, Sam has been a great help. I owe him everything and more. He's given me all the things I didn't have growing up. He's the nearest thing to a father I could have ever had. If I could go back in time and erase all the bad things that's happened to me, including that horrible beating, I wouldn't do it. That night brought me to where I am today, and no money or fortune in the world could convince me to ever give this up. I was young, maybe 20 or 21. I had this stupid idea that I was going to become a party promoter and roll that into a lucrative career as a club owner. I had no idea what I was doing, and I thought I hit the jackpot when I met this guy named Sean. He was a few years older and claimed to have a lot of experience hosting parties around the Northeast. He agreed to be an equal partner and show me all that he knew. I didn't find out it was all a lie until the damage had already been done. Early on, he convinced me to bring in this group of guys to run our security, and I knew nothing about them, but they looked the part, so I agreed. Everything Sean brought into the partnership turned to crap. The security team were the worst of it. They were more of an annoyance at first, and because they were older, they never wanted to take orders from me. I'd usually have to get Sean to talk to them. We agreed that he'd run the night of the party operations. It only made sense if the security guys wouldn't listen to me. I focused on the arrangements and booking end. Sean wasn't really interested in this aspect. After I severed the partnership, I'd find out why. I was a solo act now. I assumed the security team would leave with Sean, but I was shocked to hear that they wanted to stay on. I was too relieved to wonder why, and the next party came. Any questions I may have had, they were eager to answer. I was beginning to think that I misjudged them. Things looked like they were going to be just fine without Sean. One small thing bothered me, though. I kept seeing the bouncers going in and out of the bathrooms. Sometimes it would be 5 or more times an hour. Had it been one guy, I may have assumed that he was suffering from some sort of condition or issue that night. It wasn't, though. I finally got a free moment and followed one of them into the restroom. In the wide open area near the sinks, he was doing a drug deal with a couple of the party attendees, and I was furious. I'm no anti-drug person. If a regular guy wanted to stand outside and sell, more power to him, but these were the guys I was paying to keep the dealers out. I ran up to him and asked him what the hell he was doing, and he just stared at me with this clueless, shocked expression. I asked again, and he said that it had been okayed by his boss. I told him he was fired, and I stomped out to find Carlos, the head of the security team. I assumed that's who he meant by boss. I found Carlos at the entrance and asked him to join me in the office. I closed the door behind us and asked for an explanation. He didn't even try to hide it. I was informed that all the money Sean had put into the company came from him. In return for the loan, he would be allowed to deal exclusively at every party we threw until the loan had been repaid. I reminded him that Sean was no longer part of the company. His debts weren't my problem. He didn't care. As far as he was concerned, he wasn't going anywhere until he made all of his money back. I thought maybe I could solve the problem by paying him off. I asked what was left, and he quoted at about $10,000, and my heart dropped. There was no way I could come up with that much money. I was screwed, and he knew it. What was I going to do? Call the cops? Beat him up? Until I had the cash, I was stuck just waiting for the cops to arrest me for the crime of being naive. In the time between then and the next party, which was 3 weeks, I considered 1,000,001 different ways to get out of the problem. The prospect of jail terrified me. If I was rich, I would just have left everything and started over somewhere else. With just a few days to go, I would do the one thing I didn't want to do: go to the cops. In a way, I was kind of fortunate. Carlos and his men were wanted, but nobody was willing to say anything on the record. I didn't get the impression that they were like mafia level, but they'd drawn enough attention to themselves to get the cops interested. I'd also find out that Sean was one of them, and more than likely, a high-ranking member. No matter what, I couldn't seem to get away from that loser. I would ultimately make a deal where I testified against everyone involved and avoid any charges. I guess in the end, jail scared me more than possibly dying. The night of the party, Carlos and his team of thugs, including the guy I'd fired, showed up and did their thing like usual. About an hour passed until the cops arrived and arrested him and his crew along with a few others. I felt bad about the other people, but I knew that they'd likely get off with a slap on the wrist, if they were charged at all. When the time came, I testified and everybody was convicted. Their sentences ranged from time served all the way up to 15 years in Carlos and Sean's cases. Although my immediate problems seemed to be solved, I had no way of knowing if I was truly safe. I borrowed $5,000 from my parents and put it with what little I still had and left town. Since then, I've lived in multiple places across the country, getting work where I can and always keeping aware of my surroundings. It's been almost a decade since, and the constant moving and looking over my shoulder has come to an end. For all I know, I've done all this for nothing, and the last 10 years have been wasted. This in mind, I've decided to finally stop and put down roots. I won't say where, but I will say it's peaceful and an inviting place. Maybe I can finally find a nice girl and start a family, I don't know. If I am really being hunted and my enemies catch up with me, at least I was able to enjoy the little time of normality I had. When you've been running as long as I have, it's a simple pleasure you don't dare dream of. Wish me luck. Around 2019, I moved to Phoenix to be with my girl. I got hired as a bartender at a sports bar not long after arriving. Things didn't work out with my girlfriend, so I moved in with one of the bouncers. I'll call him Mercer for the sake of his privacy. Before I met Mercer, he'd been some special forces guy in the Marines. Several deployments later, he decided not to re-enlist. He'd worked at the bar ever since then. To make extra money, he would provide personal security for important people in the area. Most of the city's sports figures and business owners knew him and liked him. His work ethic was like I'd never seen before. I'd train with him occasionally, and he never once joked around or gave any less than 100%. I'd been living with him for about a year when he had a life-altering incident. He accepted a gig guarding a pro football player for his trip back home for New Year's. It was supposed to be a routine trip, 3 days in Atlanta and a quick flight back. I spoke to him the night that they arrived. He was relaxed and confident as usual. There was no indication of the terrible thing that was to come. The second night in Atlanta was New Year's Eve. His client had plans to meet with some friends at a club. Mercer and his guys went along, of course. They arrived at about 10:30 and were immediately led to the VIP section where his friends were waiting. A few other groups were also in VIP, but they were too involved in their own celebrations to notice his client. The client's friends had a few girls with them, and as midnight got closer, they became increasingly intoxicated. Mercer was getting more and more annoyed at their behavior. He brought this up with his client, and the athlete agreed that they should be sent away. Mercer was in the process of doing just this when a nearby VIP customer approached the group and became aggressive towards the athlete. The situation quickly grew chaotic. Mercer was attempting to get rid of the loud and annoying women and watch the angry VIP customer at the same time. He turned away for a moment, and when he turned back, the man was pointing a gun at his client. I guess his soldier instincts kicked in. He put himself between the gun and his client and took 2 shots to the chest before his guys could tackle and disarm the shooter. Mercer was rushed to the hospital and spent the next 2 days in and out of surgery. The bullets had done some major internal damage. One had nicked his spine, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Fortunately, his client was so grateful that he's taken care of all the medical bills. In addition, a couple of other business owners in the community have donated large amounts for his future rehabilitation. I don't think the doctors had ever met someone like Mercer. He was told his odds of ever walking again were next to 0. He must have taken that as a challenge. He was moving his toes within 2 weeks. It was like something out of Kill Bill if you've ever seen that. I'm sure he had the advantage of already being in phenomenal shape beforehand, but he left everyone speechless by his progression. Had he just gotten well enough to use a walker, I may have never shared the story in the first place. I don't like a sad ending to my stories, but something amazing happened today that changed things. Just 6 months after receiving the news that he would never walk again, my hero, Mercer, walked unaided today. No walker, no cane. It wasn't more than a few steps, but those few steps showed me nothing was impossible. After sharing such good news, I don't want to spend any more time than necessary talking about the shooter. As it stands, he's being held in jail without bail until the trial, and I know for sure that he's facing at least 2 charges of attempted murder. There's probably more that I don't know about, and he'll probably take a plea to avoid life because in the end, people like him are cowards. There's probably some jealousy in there too. Since things with Mercer are going so well, I don't think I'll write any future additions to the story. He's moved on, and so should we. And take his example to heart and never let anyone tell you that you can't achieve something. Mercer told me this once, and I can't think of anyone it applies to more. The only time you're guaranteed to fail is not to try at all. In my opinion, no truer words have ever been spoken. My college years were spent in the Midwest at a well-known party school. My last year there, I began dating a lacrosse player. He was the stereotypical rough and tough bruiser while also being a very smart and kind individual. That was, until we got drunk. He was never abusive towards me, but any man within eyesight was fair game. I told him I didn't like him when he was like that, and he did his best not to go overboard when I was around. He had been doing very well until the Christmas break came around. The night before everyone usually went home, a bunch of us got together and went bar hopping. Less than an hour at the first place, we all headed for our favorite spot of ours. Steve, who we'll call the guy for the remainder of the story, had a run-in with one of the bouncers in the past, but everyone, including him, believed that all to be over. He and his fellow doormen let us in without a cross word or look. Our group splintered off and did their own thing. Steve and another boy from the lacrosse team grabbed a pool table, and I joined a few girls at a table across the room. I left them to have fun and did the same with my group. Hours passed, and the bar was getting packed. Between the noise of the crowd and the music, I didn't take notice of a fight that had broken out in the back. At some point, the guy who had been playing pool with Steve plunged through a mass of people and yelled in my ear. Steve had gotten into a fight with an unknown guy. Now, the bouncers were outside beating him up. He and I struggled back through the crowd until we reached a side door. The two of us burst out of the door. To my right, I saw a pair of big guys kicking another guy on the ground. The guy on the ground wasn't moving. I assumed it was Steve, and I rushed over. The bouncers, one of which was the guy who didn't like Steve, continued kicking him until I told them that I had called 911. The bouncer, with the grudge, spit on Steve as he and his partner swaggered reluctantly away. I checked his pulse, and he was still breathing, but barely. I rode with him in the ambulance to the hospital. The paramedics were honest enough to say that he had about a 50-50 chance of living. For the remainder of that night, I wildly vacillated between utter fear and rage. I would have killed those guys with my bare hands if I could have. It was just after dawn when the doctors let me know that he was going to recover, but it was far from a complete recovery. He was never the same after that night. He never played any sports again, and his amazing mind had been greatly diminished. Seeing him now, you would never guess how bright his future once was. My discussion with the cops didn't go very well. It was clear to me that they believed the bouncer's version of events. Steve couldn't speak for himself, and his teammate wasn't much help despite seeing almost the entire exchange. When I found out the bouncers weren't being charged, I was beyond livid. A large group of students, myself among them, demanded the bar owner fire them, but he chose to side with the bouncers. There wasn't anything more that we could do after that except not go there anymore. Their college business dropped off sharply until they rebranded for a new clientele. And from what I've heard in the years since, the place has become so violent, only bikers and criminals really go there. I don't know if the bouncers responsible for Steve's awful beating still work there, but if there's any justice in the world, they'll mess with the wrong people and end up getting a life-altering beating of their own. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/LetsReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your stories featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, I'd be running up that hill